Okay.
You ready?
I think we're starting. Hi, everyone. We're going to wait a couple minutes for our online to join us. Welcome to a Curious Tour by MJ Belcourt Moses of George Little's Child's exhibition, which is closing this weekend. So we're very lucky to have MJ here to lead this Curious Tour. I just want to briefly thank everyone for being here. We also have people online. We're going to have the Curious Tour, and then we're going to finish up with a 15-minute Q&A. So think about your questions throughout the tour. And before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsor, Canada Council for the Arts, who sponsor all our digital programs. So without further delay, here's MJ.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Danse. My name is Melissa Jo Belcourt Moses. That's my full name, but I do go by MJ, so please call me MJ. My family's from the Lac St. Anne Métis community. And so the Belcourts, Latandras, the Callahus are all my relations. I'm also connected to the Michelle Band. So lots of family just west of the city. And so the Belcourts have been in this territory, in this lands for, well, the community actually sort of started around 1840s-ish. So Lac St. Anne's been sort of definitely been around for a while. So all those that are from there are my relations. My mix is Cree, Mohawk, and French. Apithagosan, which means that we're mixed blood, Métis. So that's who we are, and that's who my family is. So you also want to honor the treaty peoples that we are and the lands that we do reside on. So hi. I do want to say that I'm really grateful that I am here and was given this opportunity to showcase such a poignant exhibit. So, and I do have to apologize. I do have to refer to notes. I have just a lot going on, and I do have memories that don't connect very well. So I'm sorry, I have to refer to my notes. I wish I could just memorize everything, but. And I do have glasses. I always forget to put them on, And then I think, why am I squinting? Okay, here we go. Those are the joys, right, of getting a little older. So to begin with, though, I knew that I wanted to bring awareness to Indigenous peoples' stories, lives that we sometimes bypass. And so I was grateful when I spoke to George, and he said, I just finished a series on the children from residential schools, the unnamed, unknown children. And so I was really grateful that George, that we had talked and that this came about so that we could share this exhibit with everyone. So it's, and this was actually done before his series was finished, before the find of the 215 from Kamloops were found. So, so this has been something that has, it hasn't just arrived or just happened. We know that this has happened and has gone on for over 150 years. So we know that this has been an issue, but it's definitely come to the light, especially with the finds that of the children, unfortunately. So just a little bit about George. Over the course of about a 40-year career, George has had numerous solo and group exhibitions. His art has been exhibited in Canada, the United States, Japan, Australia, Tasmania, and Europe. As a world-renowned artist, his books and art have won numerous awards and scholarships. To date, he has curated hundreds of artwork, which hang in public and private collections around the world. He started drawing, he said, when he was around 4, or probably earlier, but when he was around 4. So he said he became a full-time artist at the age of 30. He received a diploma in art and design from the Red Deer College in 1984 and a BFA from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, Halifax, in 1988. He also received an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Fraser Valley. His socially charged mixed media paintings are in response to political movements, societal concerns, such as reconciliation, reclamation, and as well his personal history. And to quote George, He says, in my work, I am committed to righting the wrongs that First Nations people have endured by creating art that focuses on cultural, social, and political injustices. As an artist, educator, and cultural worker, my goal is a better world. It is my job to show pride, strength, and beauty of First Nations people and cultures and contribute to the betterment of mankind. I actually really like that part, that he's, contributing and wanting to contribute to the betterment of mankind. So I've known George for many years. I've admired his work. Actually, the first time I met him was at the Native Art and Show and Sale. There used to be these really amazing art shows, Indigenous art shows here in Edmonton. And it was like mid 1980s to the early 1990s. That they had these really awesome shows. And I was an art student, an Indigenous art student, to the city with my class from Lac La Biche. And that's where I met George for the first time. There was, of course, as a starving artist student, you don't have a lot of money, but he did have some art cards that I thought I can afford those. And I might not be able to afford a print or an original, but I can afford those beautiful cards. So the one that I did, actually I bought two of them, and one of them was on horses, and it was called, oh, where am I here? Spot on Horse Blanket, and the other one was Winter Count. So Martha Campio actually was one of the organizers of these big Indigenous showcases, and they were pretty amazing. There's all kinds of art from carving and quill work and beadwork and lots of beautiful paintings. And so I think I was just bug-eyed at all this beautiful work. But I did walk away with those beautiful cards of George's, and so I kind of met him there, but then it wasn't until years later that I met him again at the Alberta Museum and found out that he knew my late brother, my half-brother, Bruce Belcourt. So we became friends through that connection and just remained friends ever since. And so he's always been an encouragement to me and my artwork and my path that I've been traveling on. So a wonderful, very kind-hearted person. And once you get to know George, you realize that he does have a very kind heart, and why you can see through his art that it's very thoughtful and meaningful with whatever he takes on. So it's been good to know him. Let's see here. So welcome to the exhibit, Here I Am, Can You See Me, by George Littlechild. His Cree name is, and my Cree is not very good. I am taking a Cree course online, but my Cree is still not the greatest, but I'll just try. Nanagawasis, okay, which means swift child. So, and I wish George was here to explain that whole story, because it's a very interesting story and how it connects to Little Child as his last name. But today Canadians are living in a time of truth and reconciliation, and learning about these truths. The traumatic experience of Indigenous children, families, and communities who have survived the residential school system. The work in this exhibition includes series of drawings of First Nations children's graves, discharge records of those attended residential school in Maskwacis, Alberta, and well, I would guess it was formerly known as Hobbema. The exhibition also includes intimate photographs of George's family members. This is actually his mother here. Her name is Rachel. So that's George Littlechild's mother, and his two uncles, actually. And so they're over on this side of the wall between the nun. Those are his uncles' photographs, or pictures of his drawings of his uncles as well. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm just kind of giving you a little brief here, and then we'll get into a little bit more. So after being released at the age of 16, his mom, she was in Hobbema at that time. It was called Maskwacis today. But at the age of 16, she timed out of residential school, so she was allowed to leave. And at that time, the pass system just had been dissolved. It was in the early 60s when they finally got rid of the pass system. The pass system basically was, you couldn't leave the reserve unless you had a pass from the Indian agent. You had to get signed permission to leave. You usually carried a little pouch with you that you would keep your identification in, your number, because everyone was given a number, and your permission slip, in a sense, that if you were caught outside of the reserve, that you could show that you were allowed to leave. Maybe it was to see a doctor, maybe it was to see some family members in another part of the area. So they had to carry this with them. So it wasn't long after that, though, she came out of that experience at residential school, and she decided to come to Edmonton. She had a son, and unfortunately he passed away when he was very young, and then had 4 more children. And that's where George's family, his brothers and sisters come from. So from the same family. But unfortunately, I think the struggles, the traumatic experiences, the things that she went through were pretty hard to deal with. And so turned to alcohol, and that became something that basically took her life, in a sense. At the age of 37, she passed away, which is really a really sad story, actually. Let me see if I can get back to where I am. Yeah. So his uncles, Alfred Littlechild and Louis Littlechild. So that's these ones over here. And maybe I want to make sure I have the right ones. Okay. I think this is his Uncle Louis. But I'll just read the caption, and it says, "I draw for those who say residential school never happened. Uncle Alfred," that's Uncle Alfred, "your life ended because you died while young at Ermineskin Indian Residential School. Unknown causes." And that's the unfortunate part of it, is that there is all these deaths, but there's no reasoning behind it. It just says that they died. And so also the homage to Uncle Louis Littlechild, who died at Ermineskin Indian Residential School, 1921 to 1933. Auntie Tilly said he was an artist and nice looking. So that's his other uncle that he's representing there. So I just wanted you to make sure that you've seen that that's his family members that were here and that had gone through residential school. Okay. So the residential school system was a government policy that basically they wanted to rid the Indian and save the man. So taking young children from their family, forcibly separating and isolating them from their communities and cultures in an attempt to assimilate the people. So sadly that many children never returned from these schools. They lost their lives at the hands of the so-called well-meaning religious figures of authority. Those who have survived have had to deal with many issues from sexual, mental, emotional, and physical abuse. For almost 150 years in Canada, from 1863 to as recently as 1998, more than 130 residential schools were funded by the Canadian government until 1969. Many of these were ran and operated by the church or Christian churches. So in 2015, report by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, documented 3,200 children who had died at residential school, but the numbers of death could be 10 times more, as we're finding out, in fact. And so it is in reverence, we are deeply saddened by the recent discovery of over 7,000 children to date. And they're still counting because they're still doing the investigations and the ground penetrating machines that they have. So it's still ongoing. And so we don't know what the number will be, but it is a pretty horrible event, and it's pretty tragic when you think about that. So in George's words, and it is on the wall, but it says, "I want to give remembrance, recognition, honor, and validation to the thousands of innocent children that nobody is able to recognize as they stand amongst their fellow residential school students in the photograph, all but forgotten in the museum archival collections. In this manner, I seek to legitimize their lives and restore a modicum of dignity modicum, sorry, of dignity and importance to their short existence in the world. So through this exhibit and through George's works and the time he took to go through the photographs, that this is just one of them, one of the examples, because his mother is in this one that that we have this one in the gallery, but many photographs that he found of children that were lined up at a school, at a residential school, and a photograph taken, and even many of them, we don't know their names. George actually took it upon himself to, after he was doing all this research at the archives, taking these photos, ordering the 8x10s, he would bring them to the elders in Maskwacis and sit down and visit and talk to them and ask them if they recognized any of these children. And he said that they actually were able to identify approximately 85%, but the rest, there's no names. So just a very sad thing. And mostly this is due to the fact that they were given numbers that they had to sew in their clothing. So their names, they never used their names, they were just given a number. So, you know, if you can imagine being brought to this school, your head is shaved, you're doused with white powder for fleas. You're given basically a uniform to wear. You couldn't wear your own clothes. You couldn't speak your own language. You couldn't play any cultural games. And heaven forbid if you were caught doing some sort of little ceremony that you remembered maybe as a child, that you were punished. You were beaten and sometimes tortured, you know, to take this out of that person. And so sadly, these children lost their identity. I mean, you can't go through that experience and not feel proud of yourself. And so there's a lot of shame associated with that. My grandmother went to residential school and she denied who she was all her life, She passed away. She would tell people she was Ukrainian or French or something other because she did not want to be identified as Indigenous. So very, very sad time. And I'm really hoping that this awareness, that this type of exhibit does bring to light these atrocities, but also that that there's people that are still healing from this, and so that we can maybe have a little bit more understanding, and so that we can be a better people generally, I'd say, speaking. Okay, let me see, where am I? Okay. Okay, so this timely exhibit seeks to honor these lost souls, so the unknown will be known and not forgotten. When George was 17, he found out who his mother was, where he came from, and the tragedies of residential school and the system that robbed him the bond of a mother and child. George was part of the 60s scoop, and this is during the 60s that also another tragic ongoing sort of events from the residential school. But it was a tragic firsthand knowledge where children were taken from their home, separated from their families, and put into foster care. Just one of the impacts of the residential school system. Once he found out his beginnings, George spent many hours researching, and it took him about 11 years, he said, to actually find all his family that was still in Maskwacis in Ermineskin. So it took some time, and it was, in some ways, it was in some disbelief. He thought he was First Nation and found out, of course, his mom was, but his father was of, oh, no, I was going to say Dutch, but it's not, because that's his foster parents were Dutch descent. I can't remember. I'll have to think about that, but his father was non-Indigenous. And so, but both of them, unfortunately, both parents suffered from alcohol abuse. And so his father wasn't in the picture. And of course, his mother had passed when she was 37. His father, they believe it was either suicide or other tragedy that took his life. So, and he was also young. I think he was in his early 50s. So let's see. George also talked about going to residential school. And all 12 of their children went to residential school. That's his mom, of course, is part of the 12. And so this is something that when we think about all of it's kind of an ongoing tragedy of events. Thank you. Where children have gone through these experiences, come out, and then they're lost in many ways. So we can see what when going through, and you never had anyone to tell you that I love you, or that you're doing a good job, or to get that pat on the back or that hug, before you go to bed. And nobody was there to rescue you. Nobody was there to take care of you. You were basically alone with all these other children, but you didn't really know them. And so it was just a really tragic event. And so of what had happened. And often going to bed hungry, they ate porridge every day. They didn't have a balanced diet. It was just porridge, a lot of porridge, from what I understand and what I've read about too. So so then in the 94 calls to action under the heading Missing Children and Burial Information, these children are finally being acknowledged, and work is begun to recognize and to remember these lost souls. So under the calls 71 to 76, I'm just going to briefly go through it. There's a lot more to the highlights. The commission calls under chief coroners and vital statistics agencies that have not provided death records to commissions to make the documents available to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And this center is actually in Winnipeg. They ask that the resources be made available to the center to allow it to develop and maintain a national residential school death registry established by the commission. They also ask the federal government to work with churches, Aboriginal communities, and former residential school students to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries, included where possible plot maps showing the location of residential schools. So they're doing this right now with the ground penetrating graves that they've found. So it's, in some ways it's encouraging, because now at least we'll have a better idea of how many lives were lost, and then they can be taken care of too. They ask that churches and Aboriginal leaders inform families of the children's burial locations and respond to families' wishes for appropriate commemorative ceremonies and markers, and reburial in home communities where requested. They ask for the implementation of strategies and procedures for the documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school ceremonies. The commission also asks that the consideration be given to allow communities to lead the process, that information be sought from survivors and knowledge keepers to develop these strategies. Lastly, they asked the Aboriginal protocols that these protocols be respected before any technical, potentially invasive inspections or investigations be done in these cemeteries. And so protocol meaning that they would probably have some pipe ceremonies or smudging, these kind of things that would happen or take place. So let's just kind of walk around a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about the Spirit House. Yeah, maybe, no, actually we'll do that at the last. Why don't we just talk about George's work for now, and we'll go from here. So if you notice that all of the drawings there's not a lot of color. And if you know George's work, his work is so vibrant and so colorful that this is just a really high contrast to what his normal work is. And when you see his work, so, but it is a series on the subject matter, and that's why he has painted it or drew it. And usually he's painting, so I always want to say painting, but he drew this with pencil mostly, and some markers and the things and those kind of things. So, but you'll notice that there is red around all of the people. And so this red is symbolic of the blood lost, but also that in residential school that Christ was died for your lives. And so this is something that was indoctrinated to these children, that they knew that when they were going through this residential school system. Of course, a lot of the crosses you'll see And most of them, they don't have names written on them, but they are crosses representing being in these church-run institutions. When I asked George and talked about the exhibit and having a red wall, and I said, I just think, you know, we need something that's really bold and also to reflect and symbolize that the blood lost again, and of course what it represents for George as well. There is some of them just are saying unidentified. This one is typical, unidentified child from the Ermineskin Indian Residential School, and it has a number 4. So he drew these and put numbers to them just in sequence of how he time. And so when it came to displaying them, I asked him, do you want them changed? Do you want it separate? He says, no, let's just leave it as that way so that people can understand where I started and the progress of how I kept going with all the drawings. So that's why we laid it out just as is. But I thought it was interesting when we have that number 1, number 2, number 3, as it goes on, that these children, again, weren't given a name, they were just given a number. And so they are unidentified in this way. The doors and the windows that you see in his drawings also represent being able to look out, but not being able to leave. And so a longing for their home, their way of life. So, but unfortunately, these things were taken away from them. You'll also notice that there's all these little checks that are counting or marking off. And those are actually from the priest's perspective, the souls that they've saved. So many checks like as he has in his drawings. This one over in particular, he has little oat grains. So that's representing the porridge, and that's what they were allowed to eat and given to eat. Lots of porridge. He has the crosses on the side as an X, and it's the wrongs that were done. And so that's what is represented in. And so more of the crosses without names on them that we can see here. It says unidentified grave markers at Ermineskin grave. So that's the same on unidentified grave markers. Again, the windows and the doors not being able to leave. And then there's this one here. And if we notice, there's like little tiny little eggs is what he has here. And he has one that is blown up, identified as a lice. So these are lice eggs that he has. I wish he would have, I mean, maybe this does sort of look like that child's hair and head has been shaved, but when he talks about that powder being thrown on them so that they didn't have to deal with the lice, it makes you think of a concentration camp. It's not a school and where children are going to learn. They're being kind of locked in and in prison, and they're basically there to work. The girls cleaned and sewed, and the boys did outside work. So they did get some education, of course, but really it was these children that were working and in these labor camps in a sense. So this is the nun that is actually in the photograph. So he took that photograph of the nun and drew her here. So she just looks very hard, mean, and not very pleasant. He did talk about one of the nuns that had taken off her habit or hadn't put it on yet, and her head was shaved bald. And because they kept those habits on all the time, and so the children never really got to see them what they look like without that on. So, but George did talk about that as an experience that he heard from one of the elders. This picture here of one of the priests at these white strips behind him is actually the bones of the children, and so that's what's represented in this one here. Kind of makes you feel sick, actually, if you think about it. So it's not a very pleasant thought, but this is Father Pierre Moulin, bringer of souls to Jesus and God. They talk about he went to the elders and had a visit with them, and the elders told him how when he first arrived, he was a very slim, tall man. And then as the years went by and he was at the residential school, he said he became very overweight. And he said he had a big belly. And yet the children went to bed, hungry. And yet the priest and, were, of course, had to have been indulging somewhere I mean, he wasn't starving, obviously. So just kind of sad when you think about that too. So these are the discharge papers that George found. This is not his writing. He basically drew it as it was from these books, discharge books. But he says he started noticing something that through them, the reason why they left, so their grade, their age, and why they left. So there was lots that timed over, but they were sickly, lots of sickly. And then he started noticing that there was a lot that said dead or died, death, but there was no reason beside it. It just said they died. So, and that's what I mentioned earlier, which was unfortunate and so through this, he drew this one with tears. So there's tears on this discharge paper here. So, and unfortunately this one, there's 1, 2, and this is just a few little samples of it, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this one that says dead. So you can imagine how many more thousands have died. So the last ones here we have, and George said he had to take some pauses in between. I forgot to ask him, I really should have asked, but I wondered how long it actually took him from start to finish when he started this series. But he said he had to take breaks. He had to go and sort of cleanse himself, rejuvenate himself a little bit, because it's very heavy work. And when you're doing all this research and you're going through all this, and then you have to, you're internalizing it so that you can bring it back out to draw what he did here. And so it did take some time, and it took a lot out of him in a sense, because it's just the subject matter itself is just heart-wrenching. So these last two, of the young boys here, are of his relatives. Again, this is his uncles, and they unfortunately died in residential school as children. So just very tragic when you think about it. It just makes you want to, well, I have actually cried over it. So it is very sad. So this one here is called Sister Nun the Problem, and the young girl here crying, red tears down her face. So and all the arrows pointing at the nun. So it's just that sort of come to that realization that they thought they were doing good. In a sense, they felt that they were doing what was right, that they were taking these children, these savage little beings, and they were going to make them Christians. And so, it's hard to think of it that way, but that's what they believed, that they were doing the right thing. And sadly, there is such well, it's been a perpetuating sort of what do you call that? My brain isn't thinking here, but where it's ongoing, that, sadly, these ones, like his mother, she turned to alcohol abuse, and that took her life. And then some of, the children after that also had some issues, and just dealing with all these things has been a hardship, but we're all still healing. Not everyone has gone down that dark road. As George said, art saved his life. Without being creative, he doesn't know where he would have been, but art really was something that kept him grounded, and he was able to express himself and find himself through art. So we can be happy about that. So, because we know there's many, many more that Indigenous young peoples that have come through that and that healing process, and in a creative way. So I think that's kind of it for my Oh, right. I did want to talk about the Spirit House before we leave. I'll talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to be done. So when I was talking to George about the exhibit, when I was a little girl, I was about 3-4 years old. I was really little. I was with my dad, and we were at a river. I don't remember much. I just remember we were up north. We lived up north in Fort McMurray. Actually, my dad took a job up north. We actually had to fly there. There was no roads at that time. It was a long time ago, I know, but don't think about that. But so I remember just this being by the river with my dad, and there was these little houses, and I went to investigate. Of course, Dad was busy talking to people, and I went, and I just remember putting my hand in, trying to reach, because there's a little hole on the one side, and I was trying to reach what was ever in there. And I seen little books. I have these little tiny memories of that. And so I remember my dad shooing me away and telling me to get out of there and not to bother it. But then as I found out later that this is actually called a Spirit House, and it is something that is done. Indigenous peoples all over the country have different ways of looking after their loved ones when they pass. But this is one example of a people from up north, from the Anishinaabe people, and also in the States, where they do have these spirit houses. And it is really to protect the body, and so until the soul has a chance to pass on into the spirit world. And so there is a little hole on the west side. It's always facing west, and so that's where that soul is able to leave through, and also that you can leave offerings, things like little books or tools or trinkets or things like that person may have liked. And so that's where they were kept. And so because I talked to George about it, and I said, I just think it would be really interesting to have something like that here, because this was a protection. This protected that being, that person that had passed, and their bodies were protected here. And unfortunately, the children in residential schools were not protected. And so this is kind of that symbolism of giving them protection again. So this is why we decided, when I talked in conversation with George, that we would have this in the center. This was not part of his exhibition. This is something that I brought to George and asked him if it was okay. And he actually really liked the idea. And so we had this one built here at the art gallery here. And so this is basically what they look like. And that's kind of it when it comes to that. So I just thought it was just having that symbolism here of the protection again for those young ones. So, but that's my tour for today. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate that there is some people in the audience, and I was worried about that, but thank you.